Such ID.4s are actively imported from China for a very simple reason: they are cheaper and there are no problems with imports. For comparison, the cost of the German ID.4 in Europe varies from 42 to 52,000 euros. And the Chinese ID.4, already brought to us, will be cheaper, in the range of $35,000 to $45,000. Versions X and Cross are slightly different in appearance. They have different bumpers at the front and rear, and there are differences in the style of the headlights and lights. The Cross version is as similar as possible to the European one, and the X version is more original, with corners extended along the wings and a hefty beam of rear lights. But, in essence, both versions are identical. However, if you carefully study the configuration and equipment, it turns out that the Cross version is richer. It has adaptive shock absorbers and driver's seat memory. The top version has a panoramic roof with sunroof. The X version has more options for body color and interior decor. These machines have been produced since 2021. There are versions with rear-wheel drive and all-wheel drive. The most basic version, Pure, is equipped with a battery with an available capacity of 50 kilowatt-hours, and the rear motor produces 177 horsepower. The remaining rear-wheel drive modifications have a battery of 77 available kWh, and the engine power is 204 horsepower. The all-wheel drive version with two engines has 310 horsepower. The power reserve of versions with the maximum battery is up to 600 kilometers. In terms of dimensions, these crossovers almost exactly match the second-generation Tiguan. The body is almost 4.6 meters long, but the wheelbase is about 8 centimeters longer. In general, the VW ID.4 is a fairly roomy car with a rear trunk capacity of 484 liters. As usual in our review, we will talk about operating experience, breakdowns, problems, and ways to solve them. In general, if you have owned a Chinese ID.4 for several years, then you have probably already been through a lot and learned a lot. Especially if you communicate closely in a friendly community with other owners of these cars. Let's start with some things that have been successfully resolved. For example, the cold weather range of the ID.4 was not impressive because already at temperatures of +8 degrees and below, the thermal management system heated the battery at full strength. Naturally, a lot of energy from the battery itself was spent on heating it itself. Just last spring, new firmware changed the approach to battery air conditioning. When the battery is warmer than +8 degrees, its heating is turned off. When the battery temperature is from 0 degrees to +8 degrees, the heating power is 50%. And only at temperatures below 0 degrees the battery is heated to full capacity. Even the old VW ID.4 firmware, the version of which began with the number 15, was incredibly buggy. Some assistants constantly fell off, such as parking sensors and cruise control functions. But the most annoying thing is that both screens, the instrument panel and the multimedia device, remain black after starting the car. At the same time, everything seems to work in the background, but you can't really use anything. Probably all owners of early VW ID.4, i.e. those released before 2022, remember the multi-stage reboot ritual with pulling out the fuse and removing the 12-volt battery terminal for half an hour. Sometimes I had to reboot 3, 4, 5 times to revive the screens. This problem mainly occurred during the cold season. Later, VW even issued the following recommendation: you need to turn on maximum windshield airflow. It is activated by double pressing the button on the left side of the light control panel. The airflow will warm the head unit and it will turn on. True, there were many cases when the head unit froze tightly. For fairly decent sums, rare specialists could revive the head unit. But sometimes it died for good. It needed to be completely replaced. New firmware released about a year ago, the numbers of which begin with the number 28 or 29, not only optimized the thermal management of the battery, but also cured the software from many glitches. The problem of black screens also seems to be a thing of the past. But, in fact, not really. Sometimes the screens still don't turn on. And then a service bulletin arrived. VW determined that the screens not turning on was due to the discharge of the 12-volt battery. It is required to be replaced under warranty. Outside of China, VW ID.4 fans are trying to keep this battery, and it is a completely ordinary lead battery, in good shape. At least they recharge. The standard battery can also be replaced with an improved one such as EFB or AGM. Speaking of firmware, they do not arrive here by air. Firmware needs to be uploaded to each unit. This procedure can take a whole day, but it is done by dealers. Outside of China, this is done by individual specialists. They install the firmware as an official dealer would do it. This service costs a lot of money, but it is most relevant for the earliest VW ID.4, which came off the production line with firmware, the first number in the code being 15 or less. The most current firmware has numbers with the numbers 29. Such machines began rolling off the assembly line about a year ago. You can only update the firmware of the multimedia system yourself. The firmware can be downloaded to a USB flash drive and installed. Multimedia software is posted on, so to speak, a club resource, where the entire installation and update process is described in detail. True, it is still worth having a contact with a specialist in reviving control units because the update can sometimes end with a black screen. The software installation will fail. Speaking about the VW ID.4 multimedia device from China, it should be noted that it is tailored for China. Let's start with the fact that there are only two languages to choose from, English and Chinese. Outside of China, any internet connection does not work. The multimedia software supports Apple CarPlay, but there is no support for Android Auto. The standard navigation does not work at all, due to GPS being disabled outside of China. Sign recognition works poorly and you cannot set the charging hours in the car. This is important for those who charge from their own socket. Full functionality in other languages, including Russian, can be obtained if you install a head unit from the European VW ID.4. This is possible, but it will cost a couple of €1,000. Although, maybe someday this problem of Chinese head units will be solved. We've heard that some owners aren't aware that the traction control switch is off. It's just that this tick is hidden deep in the car's settings menu, on the brakes tab. In fact, at this point we can finish the review of problems and sores of the VW ID.4, because all other unpleasant things happen to him rarely, and are not systematic. Interior ergonomics sometimes raise questions. The windshield blower activation button is located on the light control panel. This has already been discussed. And there are only two power window control buttons on the driver's door armrest. You can control the rear door windows by pressing the rear button. Folding the mirrors and turning on their heating is controlled by rotating the joystick for adjusting them. VW ID.4 with panoramic roofs has a creaking sound in the entire dome. We know that the panorama creaks on European ID.4s too. Roof creaking appears and disappears depending on the temperature. Nothing can be done about it. Although if in warm weather you spill silicone on the glass panel sill, this can eliminate the squeak. But if the panoramic roof curtain creaks, then its guides can be lubricated. Sometimes the head-up display screen squeaks. If this squeak bothers you, you can remove the panel around the projector and the projector itself, cover them all with fabric tape and thereby remove the squeak. Sometimes the tailgate door squeaks. It can be eliminated by replacing the rubber stops, the so-called cone bumpers, 5E0827239A, 5E827341, 5E5827240. These parts fit many common VW and Skoda models. A more pressing problem is that the capacitive sensors in the door handles do not respond in wet weather or when the handles are covered in road grime. If the sensors do not work, the keyless entry system will not unlock the central locking system. In wet weather, the sensor in the handle may be triggered if you press your entire palm against it. Someone manages to disassemble the handle and carefully seal the sensor. But in general, in order to unlock the central lock without pressing the button on the key fob, the outside door handle must be dry and clean. VW ID.4 has a maintenance schedule. You need to visit service technicians every 10,000 kilometers, although this interval can be increased to 20,000 kilometers with a standard head unit. The list of maintenance work consists almost entirely of inspection activities. What needs to be changed? Cabin filter, once a year. Brake fluid, once every 2 years. Checking the wheel alignment angles should be done at approximately 3,000 kilometers. This is a control check after the vehicle starts operating. An interesting feature of versions with a heat pump, these ones use R744 refrigerant in the air conditioning system. This is highly purified carbon dioxide, CO2. Often ID.4 owners want to change and service something in their cars. And then the choice falls on gearbox oil. There is simply no other oil here. It's probably not for nothing that they do this. It's worth changing the oil and making sure that about 900 grams of oil is poured into the gearboxes, because sometimes there is a little less. To change the oil in one gearbox, you will need a liter canister of branded transmission oil, GO52527A2, $70, or its equivalent, about $15. There is a drain hole and a control/fill hole on the side. There is no oil filter in the gearboxes. Speaking of the chassis, we can recall that on some VW ID.4 clicks are heard in the area of the hubs. Clicks are heard when starting and changing direction. The clicks can be removed by tightening the bolt, WHT005437A, that secures the axle shaft and the wheel bearing. Sometimes the shock absorbers in the rear passive suspension knock. They can be replaced with original ones from the European version, 1YA513049A, or an analog from Bilstein, 19 to 324,586. True, each such shock absorber will cost $250. If something rattles from behind when driving, then pay attention to the hoses and wiring harnesses laid in the wheel arches. They can tap on the surface of the arches mudguards. The suspension of these cars is unremarkable and, in fact, the same as that of models on the MQB platform. Although the platform here has a different name, MEB, for electric cars. VW ID.4 from both Chinese factories are already appearing in spare parts catalogs. All part numbers are there, but not all spare parts are in stock. Therefore, we do not have extensive information on prices for you today. The ball joint 1ED407365 can be easily removed from the lever, but is not yet sold in online stores. But it can be found on the Chinese marketplace. With delivery it will cost about $40. Both front control arm bushings look the same, but they are different. The front 1ED407182D can be found both original for $50 and not original for about $15. The rear one also went on sale for $50. 1ED407183D. Front stabilizer struts, 1ED411315C, are available for sale for $10 to $45. You can also find support bearings for front shock absorbers, 1ED412331B, from $50 to $80. The rear suspension has 5 levers for each wheel. The upper silent block, 1ED505203, of the fist, and a pair of lower ones, 1ED505172 and 1ED505553, are detailed separately. For now, they can only be found for sale on Chinese marketplaces. Bearings for both axles come with the hubs, but are not available for sale yet. But there are no complaints about the suspension yet. Too little time has passed. These cars have not traveled so many kilometers for the suspension parts to ask for replacement. In general, any spare parts for these machines can be ordered and delivered directly from China. There are offers, but you will have to wait for delivery. The story of the VW ID.4 is just beginning, but everything looks good. If we dwell on some problems, then glitches in software and electronics are causing concern. However, all these problems can be eliminated. It is better to immediately purchase the latest version of the VW ID.4 or an older car, but with all the units reflashed. Well, we will be watching these VW electric cars from China. Perhaps we will return to them with a new review in a few years.